Hello, everyone. My name is Dominic Hamm, and I'm here to present the research that I've been conducting with my colleague Dr. Francisco Barroso from the Universidad Loyola on the role of narratives in the Israel-Hezbollah war. I will talk about in the introduction, a little bit about the time frame of what actually occurred on the ground in the region. We'll talk about our objectives, the methodology that we applied, our key findings, and then we will draw a brief conclusion based on those. So just a quick reminder, the conflict in this region, which we consider as the latest, is Israel-Hezbollah conflict, actually started with the Hamas-led attack on Israel on the 7th of October. And as you go through the time frame here, you can see how the conflict escalated over time with the infamous pager explosions and the walkie-talkie explosions in Lebanon in September, assassinations of very senior members of Hezbollah, all the way to the assassination of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah on the 27th of September in 2024, and the beginning of a ground operation of the Israeli Defense Forces on the 1st of October, and the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon on the 27th of November. This time frame is important to keep in mind because it shows what occurred on the ground, actually physically in the region, and the statements that were given by the representatives of both sides. They were meant to either underline certain readings of the conflict and to influence our interpretations, obviously, on what occurred, so that we would understand the military actions in different manners and give one side or the other more legitimacy. In total, in the given time frame, Netanyahu, between the beginning of the conflict and the ceasefire agreement, Netanyahu gave 82 statements and Hassan Nasrallah gave 27 speeches. Sounds like Netanyahu spoke a lot more, but that's actually not the case because Hassan Nasrallah's speeches were much longer than the speeches of Netanyahu. So the statement or the communication material is actually fairly similar between those two actors. The main objectives that we have in our research is to find out how speeches and statements intended to influence interpretation of events by different actors, how these contribute to the underlying dynamics of the war itself and its interpretations, how these affect discussions around the conflict arena, and how they influence interpretations of the aftermath of the fighting, which we are witnessing as we speak. In our methodology, we applied two key concepts. We used the Shannon and Weaver's model of communication as the underlying methodology, and just simply to highlight that every form of communication consists of a sender, in this case, Benjamin Netanyahu or Hassan Nasrallah, who encode a message with the intention of delivering it to different audiences who then decode it, depending on their ideological perspectives, experiences, and so on. And we want to apply uh, this concept and enhance it through critical discourse analysis to look deeper into what are the underlying intentions actually of the way that messages are being delivered and how they are being received by different receivers. So for that, we apply critical discourse analysis in order to study speeches held during the Israel-Hezbollah war to examine the relationship between discourse and social power and ideology. It will help to understand how language functions in the context of war to produce, reproduce, and challenge power dynamics through an influence on interpretations of military activities. The key objectives here are to uncover underlying ideologies of different recipients of statements, to examine attempts of exerting power and control to influence public opinions, and to highlight how social change is intended or resisted through statements. And we will focus on the language that's used in those statements itself, choice of words, grammar, sentence structure, and so on, and very strongly metaphors, as well as intertextuality. Hence, how does a single statement fit into the larger context of the general discourse that's being attempted to influence through each statement? So just in looking at the meta narrative of the conflict, the bigger picture, we can see that the general understanding of the conflict in its discourse shifted from a tit-for-tat kind of understanding based on skirmishes between Hezbollah and Israel in the very limited border region in the south of Lebanon and the north of Israel, towards a more regional perspective with more emphasis on the larger picture of actors that got involved. Hence, there was more of a narrative about proxy conflicts where the role of Iran was emphasized by different actors, and also the influence of other external parties that had interest in the Middle East. By late 2024, as the situation escalated further, you can see that the meta narrative shifted more towards a wider regional conflict understanding, and the the emphasis went far beyond just this limited border region between Lebanon and Israel, but rather covered almost the entire Middle East with all its actors and other interest groups involved in it. To break this down a little bit, we found out that the main aspects that were tackled were the ideological and political narratives, and those we wanted to analyze in more detail. So we wanted to understand the way that the conflict was ideologically framed and how that became a major component of the public narrative throughout 2024, as both sides worked to shape the narrative in ways that aligned with their political and ideological goals. From the Israeli perspective, that meant that there was a strong emphasis on security and deterrence. Benjamin Netanyahu repetitively talked about self-defense, that Hezbollah forced Israel to take the military actions that they ended up executing. They also highlighted that Hezbollah was an Iranian proxy, and hence that the political stakes are much, much higher than just the Israeli Defense Forces fighting against what most Western countries define as a terrorist organizations, and hence Hezbollah, but rather that it's a representation of Iranian interest and that there's a direct Iranian involvement in this conflict. And the last point that he repetitively highlighted and then also coined as the main goal of the war was civilian protection, mainly of the citizens of Israel living in the north of the country, to be able to move back into their homes safely and to continue their lives there. And here's a picture from one of the talks that Netanyahu gave at the United Nations in New York City on the 27th of September 2024, just a few hours before the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, which we saw in the time frame earlier on. On the other hand, we have Hezbollah's narrative, which focused on different three main components, which is resistance and liberation, where Hassan Nasrallah always tried to connect the actions of Hezbollah to their support of the Palestinians and try to portray Hezbollah as a protector of the Palestinians and the Lebanese people against what they defined as one mutual enemy, which is Israel. Also, as the conflict continued and as Hezbollah managed to maintain its military impact on the other side of the border, the military capabilities and the sovereignty of Hezbollah as an entity became more emphasized in Hassan Nasrallah's statements. And last but not least, the idea of uniting different Arab actors underneath a mutual enemy, which is Israel, became more and more prominent throughout Hassan Nasrallah's speeches. Here's just a screenshot taken from one of Hassan Nasrallah's speeches, this one from the 14th of July 2024. And then there was different forms of media coverage and public perceptions of the conflict, and the media narrative surrounding the Israel conflict in 2024 reflected shifts in ideological framing while also influencing the broader public perception of the conflict. In Western media, we can see that the focus started in early 2024 with Israel's right to self-defense, fighting against a terrorist organization, which, according to most Western countries, is Hezbollah, towards by mid-2024 to focus on a humanitarian impact where the people in the south of Lebanon were considered the main victims of the conflict, and which led to an increased attention on on the necessity of a ceasefire in the region, and which then obviously led to Israel being portrayed in a completely different light compared to how it was portrayed in early 2024, which we can also see by just comparing different New York Times articles throughout the year, where you can see on the left side earlier in 2024, you can see that Israel was portrayed as the actor who's under threat by a terrorist organization, people living in fear, and then shifting to the right-hand side, second half of 2024, we can see that Netanyahu was more portrayed as the villain in this, causing harm to civilians in the Middle East, and the UN pushing very hard for a ceasefire, an end of the violence in the Middle East. On the other hand, in the Arab media and media in the Middle East, Hezbollah's narrative of kind of the resisting force was strongly underlined, especially in Lebanese media. And as the conflict continued, Hezbollah's military achievements were also highlighted more and more, by also coining Israel as the key enemy, and that also giving more legitimacy to the operations of Hezbollah. And obviously in Iran, the role of Hezbollah as part of the Iranian, what they call axis of resistance against Israel, was very prominent. Here are some examples from Middle Eastern news outlets. This is MTV, a Lebanese TV station. One of the headlines from their website says that how much did the number of martyrs reach since the Israeli aggression began? I think just the wording here is quite interesting. Obviously, this relates to the entire number of people who were killed in Lebanon because of the war between Hezbollah and Israel, but they're all called martyrs here, which is a very interesting choice of words, and also the Israeli aggression, kind of coining it in the sense that Israel is the attacker and Hezbollah is the protector, which is very contradictory to different narratives in Western media, and contradictory to Netanyahu's type of narrative about this conflict. You can also see in Al Jazeera that there was always a very little differentiation between Hezbollah fighters and civilians when it came to victims of the war, and terminology like psychological warfare, for example, mourning, horrific Israeli attack, and so on, were very prominent in those channels. And social media also played a very significant role, because this presentation is fairly short. Just compared two different Twitter channels here. We have the Middle East Observer, which is very pro-Hezbollah, which highlighted the destruction and the killing conducted by Israel as such, while other channels which were more pro-Israel, like this one here, highlighted the warnings that the IDF sent to civilian groups, and trying to portray the Israeli airstrikes as very, very targeted, underlying those arguments with pictures which are intended to be reminders that it's very necessary for the self-protection of Israel to run those operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And as some concluding remarks, by the end of 2024, the public narrative about the Israel-Hezbollah conflict has evolved into a more complex, multi-layered story. It was no longer framed solely as a series of border skirmishes, but as a regional conflict with geopolitical stakes involving Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, and other regional powers. The public discourse was marked by ideological polarization, with each side framing its actions as defensive and legitimate, while the international community struggled to broker a ceasefire or resolution to prevent the conflict from escalating further. And as we saw throughout the negotiations that finally led to a ceasefire agreement, even within single societies, there were very different interpretations of the legitimacy of the conflict and the actions of the different actors involved in the region, because of how the narratives were framed in such contradictory ways. And the shifting narrative reflects how the Israel-Hezbollah conflict continues to be both a local struggle and a global issue, shaped by broader political, cultural, and ideological forces. And that's it for now. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're very much looking forward to further discussing those points with you below in the comments. Thank you.